Welcome back to Preparing for the Unexpected. Today we are talking with Daniela Parka. Daniela, thank you so much for segment one and two, talking about vendor risk management and third-party risk management. We're going to change gears for our third segment here. You recently gave a keynote address at the Continuity and Resilience Today conference in Toronto in, what was it, end of October, I believe?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
remember right? Yeah, October 22nd. That's it. And the session was titled Staying the Course, Resilience in Times of Internal Uncertainty. Can you tell us about your session?
yeah, absolutely. So I picked that topic because I find that a lot of times when organizations are struggling internally, our professions and the risk folks, the business continuity folks, we sometimes get pushed aside, right? Because we're oftentimes looked at, the no department and we're just a compliance exercise. And so my presentation was really focused on how do we as resilience professionals continue to provide support, value, and how do we actually present that? And so I focused on three main components. One of them that I believe that we all have superpowers because the skills that we need to be continuity professionals are those are superpowers, right? We look at things big picture. We know how to deal with stress. We can handle stressful situations. And so I think we bring a lot of value to the table there. And then I transitioned into, how do we talk strategy and how do we talk risk? Because ultimately, everything we do as an organization, even for us in risk and resilience, has to tie back to the strategic goals of the organization. And I think we sometimes forget that. And then how do we actually present that as a reason why we bring a lot of value and we need to continue to be supported even when there's, maybe that's an afterthought for everyone. And then when it comes to talking risk, how do we actually express what that means? Because we talk about risk, right? We say there's a risk of this or a risk of that, but can we actually speak that language that matters to people that aren't risk managers, that they understand the impact, they understand likelihood, they understand what does this actually mean for me and the organization and why should I pay attention?
That expressing risk, it goes back to something we talked about in the first or second segment, where it's understanding project management and communicating risk there. Because
Hmm.
I I learned in project management the if then so what statement.
Yes.
If
Yeah.
this happens, that is impacted, and this is why. This is
Yeah.
what
And
it
we
do.
we took it a little further, right? So we have the so what test similar to that. If you present a risk and the other person is probably thinking, so what? And then the question is, then what, right? Then what do I do? You always have to come prepared with here's the risk, here's how this translates into impact for the organization, and here's my recommendation as to what we should do, because people just don't necessarily think that way, right? And
Right.
again, they have to understand impact because expressing risk is always if then, right? And so that so what question is something that I always have in the back of my mind. It's clear as day to me. That doesn't mean that the rest of the world actually sees it the same way.
True, true. So with resilience professionals, we always seem to, like you said, be kind of one of the first groups to be either ignored or let go or cut
Hmm.
back on or something like that. Since we're not a revenue generator, is there any way that we can turn around our discipline so that it helps generate revenue? Is there something we can
Well,
do to show that?
I mean, we may not ever be considered a revenue generator, but the way I look at it is we can make all the money on the front and it can walk right out the back door, right? And we're kind of the guardians of that back door in a way, right? Um, we also, I believe, as risk managers, we help organizations actually take risk. It's back to there's upside risk and there's downside risk, right? And usually we think about risk as a negative thing, but there's also risks that we should take because they make sense financially. And we are the professionals that have to bring that to the table. And then, again, that to me is where we bring value that you can translate into dollars. Or also saying, maybe that risk that you're so worried about, because the word gets used a lot by everybody, but then actually quantifying it and saying, well, is it really that big a deal? Or, is it not? And what are you doing? Are you over managing risk? Could we save some money here? I've seen that before. Actually, I see that a lot where risk is over managed and you're spending a lot of money on mitigating something that really doesn't have that large of an impact. That's saving money, right? So I think there are definitely ways that we bring value and you can quantify that into dollars. Is it ever going to be considered revenue generating? Probably not. But again, it can walk right out the back door unless we are there saying, here's a couple of things we need to do so it doesn't walk out the back door.
I can't help but think again back to the first and second segment that if we're expressing risks from a business continuity, disaster planning, resilience perspective, that we need to prioritize those risks, as you were saying, right? We can't just throw all these things out there because then it's like, oh, the sky is falling. We
Yes.
become Chicken Little. We have to do our due diligence as to what risk really means and where it needs to go and who needs to understand it, right?
Yeah, and we also have to check ourselves because to your point, so Chicken Little, I usually get called Debbie Downer because I live in worst case scenario land usually. It's, just due to what I do. But we have to check ourselves too. And a lot of times I will use my peers or a team and I'll be like, "Hey, I need you to bias check me on this, right? Like, can you help me? Like, let me walk you through my thought process and tell me, am I missing something?" Just because we're in that field doesn't mean that we don't fall into the same traps that everybody else falls into, but we definitely need to be aware of them. And I think that it's on us to do the same thing that we expect other people to do because we expect other people to come to us and help them understand risk. But who's checking us, right? Because we deal with
Right.
bias. And so I definitely feel that we have to do the same thing and really asking ourselves like, am I overreacting to this because I saw something on the news yesterday, or like, how am I going to quantify it? And then when I'm done quantifying it, is it still that big a deal? So yeah, it doesn't just go for the rest of the organization. We have to practice that as well.
How do we get our message up the pipeline? Because quite often we're departments of one, and we don't have that hierarchical clout to
Hmm.
get our message across. So if we are in that position, how can we get our message so that people who need to understand it,
Hmm.
risk or whatever it is we're bringing forward, understand what it is we're trying to convey and get that message?
Yeah, that it's a tough one and it's a challenge that I think we all have. One thing I was extremely fortunate in my career to have a very strong executive sponsor when I came up into the risk management space. I came out of operations. An executive sponsor can make or break your program, right? And I was lucky that I had a very strong sponsor who wasn't necessarily all that involved in it, but he understood the value. And so making sure that you find out who on your executive team or who up your chain is that sponsor for you and that supporter and that cheerleader. So you have to establish those relationships. That's what it is, right? And then the other thing is, it doesn't always have to come from the top down. Sometimes working from the bottom up and having small successes with the organization, especially in a resilience space, if you're, say, for example, your organization hasn't done a fire drill in years or you haven't done an evacuation in years, how do you think your employees feel, right? If you, as that champion, can say, hey, let's just do this, people will feel like, hey, they actually care about me. The organization cares about me, whether that's true or not, right? I mean, the organization cares, but they sometimes forget that there's safety is part of that. So having some successes with that and getting support from people that are just your peers, right? That can sometimes drive that message because they all have bosses and they talk to their bosses and they're like, hey, these business continuity people are actually doing something really cool and I feel much better prepared. And you have to have these ambassadors. I had a business continuity planning team at one point in time, and I called them my ambassadors. And I told them that. I said, you are the ambassadors for what we're trying to do. And I need you to be very loud about that. And, make it fun. I mean, you have to make it fun. You have to get people engaged. People have to see, again, what's the benefit. And so those are some of the ways, but that executive sponsor for me, critical, so critical.
I guess you could also do something. See, you said so much in the second segment. I've got a question that goes back again to something you said there. We could also use something from the headlines and taking a look at something that happened to XYZ Corporation and say, based on what we have in place, we have a risk. We would not be able to handle
Hmm.
that the way they did, or we would be able to, whatever it is you find. But I
Hmm.
guess we could leverage the headlines to help get our case across as well, right?
Absolutely. And you know, the headlines are actually something that your executive level pays attention to because, again, credit union space, one large credit union in California had a ransomware attack. All of a sudden, everybody wanted to know, what are we doing? Yes, unfortunate that, you have an organization that goes through that. That's back to the whole never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah,
If there's an incident, jump on it, right? Even if it's a small incident, just jump on it and say, hey, there's a few things I think we could have done differently. Can I maybe pull a team together and see where our gaps are? And you have to ask the question. It's back to if you don't get out there and talk about it and ask the question, people don't know. Not everybody thinks the way that resilience people think. Again, I also don't think like an accountant, which is why I'm not an accountant, right? But that's really your job is to ask those questions and bring that perspective to the table. So yeah, absolutely. We like headlines.
yeah. We only have 3 minutes left. Do you have any final thoughts regarding vendor management and third-party risk management, or how we in the resilience industry can really show more value and things, tips for us or something like that?
For me, key is always to link everything you do to your strategic goals, right? For the organization. If you're in a position where you've never seen the strategic goals or you don't understand what the plan is, ask to see that. Shouldn't be a secret. Everything we talked about today, the vendor management piece in particular, everything you're doing there can tie back to your strategic goals. And that is a language that especially your decision makers speak, right? They speak strategy. So understanding what it actually is that you're supporting is a big one. And that's always what I tell people. Like, how does what you do actually support the strategic goals for the organization? And then the other thing I would encourage people to do is really think bigger picture, right? Back to what we said, vendor management, it doesn't start at the vendor due diligence. It starts so much sooner. And to me, it's not a hard concept to explain, but challenge yourself to think outside of your own box and say, where else do I plug in and how else can I get there? And then just ask the question. We always assume that people know what we bring to the table. Mostly they don't. And so ask and talk about it because I think what we do is actually really cool.
Yeah, well, oh, I love it. Some of my friends think I'm absolutely crazy because, why do you like to talk about disasters and everything that can go wrong? And I don't look at it as though I don't talk about things that go wrong. I talk about how I make people more successful and I
Exactly.
reduce suffering. I said that's the way I look at it. I said that
Yep.
feels empowering to me.
Yep. I 100% agree.
And I do like walking down the hallway sometimes when a CEO or vice president steps out of their office and sees you and goes, "Uh-oh." You know, do I
What's
owe you
wrong?
something? I was like, no, you're fine. Just getting that, even though it's kind of funny, they know who I am and they know what I'm doing.
Yeah,
And I
that's
think
great.
it's a different way of looking at it, but it's great to have that feeling.
Yep. 100%.
Well, on that note, we've come to the end of the show. Thank you so much, Daniela. I really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us today.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
That was great, and it was great meeting you in person in Toronto.
Yep, same here.
And I'm sure you'll be back for a third one eventually.
I hope so.
You will, I'm sure. Thanks again, and everyone watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.